Establishing the precise origins of the Cold War can be difficult, as different historians emphasize different events and actions as the key reasons for its evolution. Many, if not most, historians focus on disagreements between the Allies during the closing stages of the Second World War and stress the importance of the events of 1946 to 48. They argue that before this period, the Cold War was not inevitable. Instead, it arose either because of the actions, attitudes, and mistakes of leaders such as Harry S. Truman and Joseph Stalin, or because both the main powers after 1948 were attempting to create their own empires for economic or security reasons. Other historians stress the incompatibility of the various security concerns of the U.S. and the USSR, the long-term vulnerability felt by Soviet statesmen given Russia's past experiences, and the pressure of big business lobbies in the USA to maintain a large defense budget in peacetime, which required a real or created enemy. This still affects us today, by the way. On the other hand, a minority of historians trace the origins of the Cold War back to the tensions between the Allies in the period of 1941 and 45. Some even go further back to November 1917 when the Bolsheviks' revolution took place in Russia and the decision by the U.S. in 1918 to intervene against the Bolshevik government in the Russian Civil War. From 1917 onwards until the final collapse of the USSR in 1991, this fundamental and underlying conflict continued, even though there were periods of improved relations and sometimes even cooperation. Although most historians argue that the events of the closing stages of the Second World War are central to the origins of the Cold War, some emphasize the view that the rivalry and hostility between U.S. West and the Soviet Union arose from the Bolshevik Revolution of November 1917. This event brought to power the Bolshevik Party under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, and resulted in the emergence of what was arguably the world's first workers' state based on Marxist ideology. According to Howard Rothman, a known historian, the Cold War proceeded from the very moment the Bolsheviks triumphed in Russia in 1917. Isaac Deutscher, a contemporary Marxist historian, saw the events of 1917 as the start of what he called the Great Contest between conflicting ideologies of capitalism and communism, illustrated by the markedly different global outlooks and aims of the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson and Lenin at the end of the First World War. The objectives of these leaders were to set against a background of fear or hope concerning the specter of communism mentioned by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in their Communist Manifesto of 1848. According to Deutscher, an intense antagonism between these two fundamentally opposed social and economic systems, one headed by the U.S. and the other by the USSR, thus broke out immediately after 1917. Each side feared the other. Western capitalist states were horrified by the prospect of a spread of revolution elsewhere, especially to economically significant states such as Germany. In turn, the new USSR feared imminent invasion by the West. In fact, the first attempts at this after the 1917 revolution took place in the period of 1918 to 1921. However, this argument is complicated by the fact that the relationship between the USSR and the West before 1941 was not always one of open anger. Consequently, it is possible to divide the period 1917 to 1941 into two different time periods, 1917 to 28, when hostility was almost constant, and 1921 to 41, when relations were more variable. The Bolshevik Revolution had a great impact on international relations and thus the foreign policies of the U.S. and the most important European states. Deutscher focused in particular on the essential motives and long-term aspirations of the USSR and other states, which lay behind foreign policy decisions during the Cold War of 1945 to 91. These, he argued, were mainly the result of states' different economic and social systems. Thus, for Marxist historians, the foreign policy of any state was usually intended to protect and further the economic interest of the dominant social and economic classes. States with different dominant classes or elites were bound to come into conflict at some point. The rivalry between the two social systems of capitalism and socialism and communism had many facets: economic, ideological, territorial, and military. Long-term explanations of the origins of the Cold War see the capitalist system as facing a direct challenge to its interests and values as a result of the revolutionary Soviet Republic's attempts to create a collectivist socialist economy within its borders. This was completely opposed to capitalism, which was based on private ownership and market economy and individualism. Furthermore, throughout 1917, the first leaders of the Soviet Russia, Lenin and Trotsky, had openly called for revolution in Europe, initially to end the First World War. They showed their calls were serious in 1919 when they formed the Communist International, usually known as the Comintern, to stimulate and aid world revolution. Capitalist companies and states were understandably suspicious and even fearful of this new revolutionary government. Consequently, from 1918 to 1921, the new Soviet state faced foreign military intervention in the Russian Civil War. Armies from the US, Britain, France, and even Japan gave supplies and assistance to the opponents of the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks saw this as a deliberate capitalist attempt to destroy their revolutionary socialist experiment. Though the Bolsheviks eventually emerged victorious from the Civil War, the United States, among others, refused to recognize the Soviet government. In 1918, Woodrow Wilson had already begun the USA's attempt to replace the old European state system with a new international order under US hegemony to make the world safe for democracy. By democracy, Wilson meant an international liberal capitalism based on free market economies and individualism. The first concrete evidence of this had been his 14 points issued in January of 1918. In 1920 to 21, Poland, backed by Britain and France, attacked and invaded Russia. The resultant Treaty of Riga saw Russia lose significant areas of land to Poland along the Soviet-Polish border. The relative general economic backwardness of Russia inherited from its Tsarist days and the impacts of the involvement in the First World War, the Revolution of 1917, the Civil War and foreign intervention, and then the Polish invasion, all combined to weaken the Soviet Union. In addition, the new Soviet Republic remained isolated after the crushing of various attempts at socialist revolutions elsewhere in Europe by 1923. In addition, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, imposed by Germany and later confirmed by the West, had deprived it of much valuable industrial and agricultural territory. The earlier attacks by the West on the Soviet Republic were replaced after 1921 by economic embargoes and bans on trade, which restricted attempts by the Bolsheviks to rebuild the Russian economy. Furthermore, the Bolshevik government was excluded from the peace settlements of the 1920s. According to the historian R.C. Nation, the result of the Bolshevik Revolution was a complex and changing relationship between the Soviet state and the West, combining ideological denunciation, isolation, coexistence, and occasionally cooperation. Both the major protagonists in the Cold War thus had a long history of fear and mistrust, whether it was Soviet fears of Western intentions to invade again at a later date, or U.S. determination to protect their global economic interest against the prospect of socialist revolutions in other, possibly more economically significant countries. Another aspect of developments in the international relationship between the USSR and the USA in the West before the Second World War, which prefigured later developments in the Cold War, was the way in which the state interests usually took precedence over commitments to their respective ideologies. Certainly from Stalin's rise to power in the USSR in 1929, the main Soviet concerns were domestic economy and political policies. In addition, Stalin's commitment to world revolution was very much subordinate to his desire to ensure the security of the USSR by building socialism in one country, a policy that had never been voiced while Lenin was alive. At the same time, the onset and impact of the Great Depression in the USA and the rest of the capitalist world meant that for many in the West, the Great Contest was of less importance than economic survival. From 1933, the threat of European expansion from Nazi Germany, the growing power of Japan in the Pacific, and the possibility of another world war all contributed to tensions between the USSR and the West, being seen by many politicians as lesser importance, at least for the time. Certainly after Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, relations between the USA and the USSR began to improve. The US at last gave official recognition to the USSR in 1933, and in 1934, Stalin's Soviet Union became a member of the League of Nations. However, this improved relationship was fragile. For instance, between 1935 and 38, the Great Purge and the Great Terror in the USSR strengthened anti-Soviet attitudes in the United States. Realpolitik refers to politics in foreign diplomacy based on realities and strategic or material needs, rather than on political principles, ideologies, or morals. This might entail being prepared to do deals with enemies in order to gain some short-term advantage. One example of such realpolitik had occurred in 1922 when the USSR signed the Rapallo Treaty with the Weimar Republic. Another example of this approach was the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of August 1939. In Cold War terms, even under Lenin, the Soviet Union had been prepared to do deals with capitalist countries in order to develop its economy. The placing of Soviet political interests above those of ideology and world revolution became much more marked under Stalin, who had seized control of the USSR by 1929. Under his leadership, the theory of socialism in one country led to the Comintern increasingly becoming almost a wing of the Soviet Foreign Ministry. Between 1933 and 1939, the Soviet Union became more willing to work with capitalist states and parties in popular fronts against fascism and Nazism. In 1939, when an alliance with major capitalist states against Nazi threats failed to emerge, Stalin decided to sign a non-aggression pact with Hitler. By doing this, he hoped to buy time and gain, or in the case of Poland, regain territory to build up Soviet defenses against the expected German invasion. This realpolitik approach to foreign affairs continued after war broke out in Europe in 1939. Stalin remained neutral until the German invasion of the USSR in 1941. After this, both he and the leaders of the US and Britain were prepared to bury their ideological differences, to unite in a grand alliance against what was seen as a greater threat. This was very much a marriage of convenience. However, Churchill never lost his early hatred of communism, and from the outset, Stalin's suspicions, strong since the Munich Agreement, persisted over the West's motives. In particular, Stalin increasingly came to believe that the West was prepared to sacrifice any number of Russian lives in the fight against Hitler. Both the US and Britain were determined to protect their global economic investments and interests from the threat of revolution. Stalin's Great Purge in the USSR, however, had the effect of strengthening hardline attitudes in the US against the USSR. Significantly, the US had set up the Division of Russian Affairs, or the DRA, which later was responsible for the important Riga axioms. This is the name given to the views and policies of the U.S. diplomatic experts based in Latvia, Riga, who worked for the DRA during the 1920s to discover Soviet foreign policy objectives. Latvia provided a haven for Russian exiles opposed to the Soviet government. Their views gradually influenced those who worked for the DRA, including George Kennan, author of The Long Telegram in 1946, to regard Soviet aims as threatening world revolution. These opinions helped shape U.S. policy towards the Soviet Union into the 1930s and 1940s. The DRA was headed by Charles Bolin and George Kennan and was much influenced by white Russian exiles opposed to the Bolsheviks, who tended to stress world revolution aims of the new Soviet state. The Riga axioms assumed real influence after 1945, when the legacy of the Russian Revolution of 1917 began once more to have a significant impact on international relations. Initially, in the period of 1939 to 41, the views of U.S. hardliners such as Kennan and the Riga axioms seemed to be confirmed by the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. This agreement was made between Nazi Germany and the USSR in August 1939. Following the Munich Conference in September 1938, Stalin had continued to urge Britain and France to join the USSR in taking military steps to stop Hitler's aggressive foreign policy. After repeated rejections, Stalin decided to accept the German proposal for a non-aggression pact in order to buy time for the USSR to prepare for the strong possibility of a German attack. This pact, which was supposed to last 10 years, did not make the two countries allies. Either way, the foreign policy of developments in the 1930s following Hitler's rise to power in 1933 played a big role in making the USSR and the states opposed to communism mutually suspicious. Stalin saw the refusal of Britain and France to join an anti-Nazi alliance, appeasement, and the Munich Agreement as encouragement for Nazi Germany to attack the USSR. The West saw the dismemberment of Poland following the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, the war against Finland, and the annexations of the Baltic states as evidence of Soviet expansionism. These mutual suspicions remained even after the formation of the Grand Alliance. When the USSR was attacked by Germany in June 1941, and then the US by Japan in December of that same year, the US and Britain soon joined with the Soviet Union in a grand alliance, as they now saw Hitler as a more serious and immediate threat than Stalin. One result was that the USA began to send military supplies to the USSR under the Lend-Lease scheme. The outbreak of the Second World War seemed temporarily to end the U.S. West versus USSR rivalry, but new problems soon emerged within the Grand Alliance and combined with the earlier misgivings. Some of these new problems included Soviet restrictions on Allied service personnel operating on Soviet territory, and what Stalin considered inadequate Allied aid, given that most Axis forces were committed to the East. He came to suspect, given the massive Soviet casualties, that the US and Britain were prepared to fight Nazism down to the last Russian. At times, Stalin even feared his allies would make a compromise peace with Hitler and then launch a joint attack against the USSR.